heard about the word violence, by the way, in Hebrew, it's the word Hamas, which has particular interest today of what's going on in the land of Israel. However, what we like to do is to look at these ideas that Isaiah is talking about. How do they corrupt the teachings? How do they violate the ordinance? And eventually, the complete downfall of society. So the very first thing we talk about is corruption of true ideas and true beliefs. Now there's a text. It's in Genesis. And
It's Brenda.
In Genesis chapter 4. And it talks about in the days of Enos. Now, in most translations that maybe you might be familiar with, especially for people that read the King James translation, for example. In the King James translation, it says in the days of Enosh, which was in the generations of Adam. In the days of Enosh, they begin to call upon the name of the Lord. Actually, it's a really poor translation, right? Because it actually says, in the days of Enosh, they begin to profane the name of the Lord. In other words, well, what does that mean? What does it actually mean? They profane the name of the Lord. It really means that nobody's calling upon the name. Nobody's actually doing that. They're not. They just quit. Okay, they quit calling upon the name. Now the question becomes, why did they quit calling upon the name? Okay. Now, what I would like to read to you, by the way, is the writings of the Rambam. His name is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and it's the Mishnah Torah, and it is Hilkot Avoda Zera. Okay, talking about the laws of idolatry. And in chapter 1, he takes up this discussion of what we just talked about in Genesis, right? So he says, during the times of Enosh, mankind made a great mistake. And the wise men, and I find this interesting, by the way, it's not the ignorant people
right.
that make this mistake, it's the wise men, right? And he says, and the wise men of that generation gave thoughtless counsel, and it says, Enosh himself was one of those who erred. Pretty interesting, right? And then he begins to tell us about their mistake was as follows. They said God created stars and spheres with which to control the world. He placed them on high and treated them with honor, making them servants who minister before him. Accordingly, now again, this is according to them, it is fitting to praise and glorify them and to treat them with honor. They, talking about these wise men, they perceive this to be the will of God. Blessed be he, that they magnify and honor those whom he magnified and honored, just as a king desires that the servants who stand before him be honored. Indeed, doing so is an expression of honor to the king. He goes on to say, after conceiving of this notion, they began to construct temples to the stars, offer sacrifice to them. They would praise and glorify them with words, prostrate themselves before them, because by doing so, they would, according to their false conception, be fulfilling the will of God. And I'd like to read just one more little section here, by the way. He said, this was the essence of the worship of false gods. This is where it began. This is how it began. And this was the rationale of those who worshiped them. They would not say that there is no other God except for this star. And he points to a passage in Jeremiah, by the way. In Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 7 through 8, he says, this message was conveyed by Jeremiah, who declared, who will fear you, O King of the nations, for you it is fitting among all the wise men of the nations. Notice that again, the wise men of the nations. In all their kingdom there is none like you. They have one foolish and senseless notion. They conceive of their empty teachings as wood. That is, all that know you, all know that you alone are God. Their foolish errors consist of conceiving this emptiness as your will. So even Jeremiah is saying that in his day they're still continuing this same false concept and false idea. I find that amazing. That it begins in the days of Enosh, it begins with the wise men, and Jeremiah is still saying it's still the wise men of the nation that's still perpetrating this false idea. And what happened was during that period of time that it was a complete breakdown of true ideas and true concepts of God. And so they violated what we refer to within the commandments of the 7 laws of Noah, the Sheva Mitzvot. It's a violation, number one, of idolatry. From the very get-go, right? There's just prohibition against worshiping anything other. And so in the days of Enosh, the wise men, not so wise, but they were supposedly the wisest of men. Their great failure was, at least, is to compare the king of the universe in the same way as the king of a nation. That was their greatest mistake in how they did that comparison. But all of a sudden, they have these corrupt ideas about God, right? And then eventually, of course, as the idolatry progresses, some guy would stand up and say he's a prophet of one of those stars, and he would say, you need to do this to worship them, you need to do that to worship them, and then, of course, idolatry becomes more and more built upon, right? And all of a sudden religions, religions are based upon these idolatrous thoughts. And so Jeremiah points out to us, it's nothing new, right? The wise people of the nations are still doing the same thing. Right. It's not the fact that they don't say that there's really only one God, but then they fabricate all these other gods. And the interesting thing that Jeremiah brings up back in the same idea is that they understood this as being the will of God. You know, that what they were doing was actually the will of God. That's what happened to the people in the days of Enosh. It's what was happening to the people in the days of Jeremiah. So we have a great similarity. But in doing so, they have violated the law of idolatry very clearly, right? But then they've also violated the law of blasphemy. Why? Because they made God into something that He isn't. You know, it's a very blasphemous idea to think that God wants us to do this or wants us to do that. It's the will of God that we should worship this star or worship something else. So this very first thing, and so when that Isaiah 24:5 passage, Isaiah makes it very clear that they had transgressed the Torah, the teachings, which would involve having really clear concepts of God and really clear ideas of God. Okay? So that's the very first issue. So all of a sudden, we begin to see the downfall of humanity very early in the days of Enosh. You know, but a belief system, having proper ideas and correct belief system, by the way, is kind of an individual thing, you know. So we hadn't really had the complete breakdown of society yet. But that's the beginning. And that's what Isaiah is saying. You know, the inhabitants of the earth, you know, why are they doing this? Well, what's happening to them is because, number one, they violate the law of idolatry and they violate the law of blasphemy. Okay? So let's take the second issue.
Corruption of the laws and robbing the rights of others.
Which he says that they've done what? According to Isaiah, they have changed what?
The teaching, the ordinances.
The ordinances, right? And ordinances at this point in time, he's talking about what? The laws, right? Now, when we start looking at the laws, for example, and I'll let you do this one, by the way, which has to do with that second corruption, right? So they're corrupting the laws, corrupting the ordinances, which means what? They're violating the laws, they're changing the laws, and of course we know why people want to change laws. It's because
they want them to reflect their will.
Exactly. They want them to do, you know, in other words, God gives laws to control men's passions.
To curb them.
To curb them. At least curb them. Well, we hope it changes them. Gives them a new direction. But at least when God gives laws, it curbs our passions. And so when these men were not going to allow their passions to be curbed, then what do?